There we go. There we are. Hello, everybody. It is 3:30, which of course means it is time for one of our afternoon STEM shows here at the Headwaters Science Center. I'm Ryan, one of the educators here, and I'm still just kind of getting settled here. But the theme for the week, as we've been doing for the last few weeks, we've been having a theme every time, and this week's theme is frogs and toads. And so on Wednesday, Lee read a couple of books about frogs and toads that I have here. He had one called Becoming a Frog that was all about kind of the metamorphosis that frogs and toads go through from egg to tadpole to froglet to frog. And then he read Hip Pocket Papa, which was specifically about the hip pocket frogs that are in Australia, kind of how they exist in their ecosystem. And then James Will yesterday did a little talk about some of our frogs and toads that we have here at the Science Center, just some of the kind of basic kind of intro to biology stuff with them. So for me today, actually, as you can probably see by the title, there happens to be a Tier Zoo video that specifically is about frogs. And so, I love Tier Zoo. I've done their videos a handful of times. So I think what we'll do today is we're going to look at the frog tier list and see how it goes. And this is going to be an interesting one for me because I honestly don't know that much about frogs. I don't know how many frogs are going to be on a frog tier list. If he's going to what even makes sense as a number, or how to break them up. Are you just putting all the tree frogs together in one, or are you separating tree frogs from into smaller individual groups? Are your dart frogs a separate thing? Are toads included? Is it bullfrogs? Is it just kind of collective pond frogs as a group? But like I said, despite kind of not necessarily knowing where he's going to be on here, I got to make my prediction. I do it every time, of what's going to be a bottom level frog and what's going to be a top tier frog and why. I think bottom tier frogs are going to be the smaller pond frogs, would be my guess. It's going to be things locally here in Bemidji, we have leopard frogs. And I bet those are going to be relatively low tier, if not on the lowest tier. Very common frogs. They reproduce very readily. They have a very big range, which is all a testament to them. But their outlook going forward, honestly, is not great. Their populations have been depleting pretty rapidly because they are very sensitive to environmental conditions. And so as the rivers and lakes that they exist in have been getting worse, their populations have fallen off very dramatically. As I said, the thing that you tend to hear about frogs and kind of the naturalist kind of biologist sense is that they're a great barometer for the overall health of whatever water system you're working in, because when the conditions start getting worse, they're usually the first thing that starts to go. And we're seeing that in a lot of places right now. And frankly, we're not doing a whole lot about it in most of these places either. So the outlook for these types of frogs going forward is probably not great, which is probably reason enough to have them be pretty low tier. As far as high tier goes, I guess probably dart frogs would probably be pretty high. They're tree frogs, which I think is pretty good. They obviously have the poison stuff, which is pretty good going for them. Reality is that there probably aren't any really actually top tier frogs, frogs that are the outlook for is awesome going forward, things that really dominate their ecosystem. Frogs just aren't that really, any of them. But I think if you're raking them within frogs, bullfrogs are probably pretty good just because they're big enough to avoid some of the predators that some of the smaller pond frogs get. And like I said, the dart frogs are probably quite good just because the poison is really good. But I bet if I know Tier Zoo, he's gonna make a point to say at the beginning of this video that there aren't really any high tier frogs. He's gonna probably rank them within the scope of frogs, but he's gonna be in the grander scheme of all the animals on Earth, the best frogs are C tier probably. He's gonna say. That's my prediction. See how accurate we are.
Long live the king. amphibians are one of the oldest factions in the game, having been added to the game in a late Devonian expansion. The marine meta at the time was hostile, to say the least. So it made sense that the devs would let smaller fish players spec into legs and lungs so they could finally join the arthropods on the terrestrial servers. The fact that amphibians have remained at least moderately viable in the meta this entire time and survived multiple rounds of balance patches is impressive, to say the least. And while the amphibian faction has several popular build styles, the most well-known is the frog. The role frogs occupy in the current meta is an odd one.
Yeah, and what he's saying there about like the frogs being, or not necessarily the frogs, but amphibians in general being like basically the first vertebrates to come out onto land is true, and that's something that like is a credit to amphibians, I guess, as a class of animal, is that they very much were the pioneers of terrestrial living. At least as far as vertebrates go, there was arthropods that were on land before them, and obviously things like plants that were on land before them as well. But yeah, it's cool that they have managed to like exist with like more or less the same kind of block of characteristics for as long as they have. Maybe this is a good thing to just quick look up here, actually. Like, what's the timeline for like when amphibians like first go onto land? Like, when are the first like amphibian tetrapods? Talking probably 400 or so million years ago, right? Yeah, 370. So, like I said, and the characteristics, like the core defining things of an amphibian, mostly haven't changed in that time, which is interesting because, like, you look at, you know, the other like vertebrate class that existed at that time, which was fish, and you see a lot of pretty dramatic changes that have happened within fish over that time, where you have, you know, your lobe-finned versus your ray-finned fish split. You have your bony fishes versus your boned fishes, and your jawless fishes split. That happen on like a not like it's a longer timeline than what amphibians have, but it's not like way longer. So I say it's interesting that like we're still looking at amphibians with very much the same types of characteristics from 370 million years ago as we have today. Oh, whoops. Closed the video.
This video was powerful builds in the entire game. Only about 0.5% of tadpoles actually reach the late game and get to unlock the rest of the frog skill tree. But is that even worth it? How viable is the frog? The role frogs occupy in the current meta is an odd one. At low levels, they're easily some of the least powerful builds in the entire game. Only about 0.5% of tadpoles actually reach the late game and get to unlock the rest of the frog skill tree.
Yeah, what he's saying there is about 1 in every 200 tadpoles makes it to adulthood, which, again, I don't know how big like an average frog clutch is, but it's more than that probably. But that's something that you see in a lot of species, is that the survival rate for the eggs reaching adulthood is actually really bad. The thing we talk about this with the Science Center a lot is with the snapping turtle, where we have an albino snapping turtle here, Rosie, who is here because her like survival chances in the wild were functionally 0. Because the survival rate for snapping turtles normally is so bad. It's like 1 out of every 100 eggs laid makes it to adulthood, roughly. It's about a 1% chance that a given egg laid is going to actually reach adulthood. And, you know, when you're albino and can't camouflage, it's even worse. But frogs face a very similar challenge, where you'll notice he said 0.5% of tadpoles, so he's not even saying 0.5% of the eggs laid. Like, these are ones that actually hatch from the eggs and become tadpoles. From that point, they still only have, you know, 1 out of every 200 or so makes it to adulthood. And when you see those types of survival rates, typically the things you're going to see with that are usually absentee parents that kind of lay eggs and then just ditch them, is typically what you see there. And then animals that have a lot of babies. You have a lot of babies, you expect that most of them are going to die, but a few of them aren't. And so that's how you keep your replacement population going. It's a very different means than what you see with like most mammals, where mammals, we tend to have a lot fewer babies, but the survival rate for them is a lot better. And that's a pretty strong correlation there is like size of litter versus survival rate of litter. The more babies you have at a time, typically the worse the survival rate is. So lots of babies, most of them die. Very few babies, most of them live usually.
But is that even worth it? How viable is the adult frog? There's some things that they're among the best at, and from a gameplay perspective, I think they offer a fun and unique playstyle. But with that said, the frog has a lot of glaring weaknesses, holding it back from a higher tier spot in the meta. Still, there are some standout members that have their own unique perks and special abilities that make them more viable than your average frog in the current meta. So today, we'll be going over the tier list of the frogs. But first, let's discuss the basic archetype and what its main advantages and disadvantages are. Taking a quick look at the frog stats, we can pretty easily see that there are a lot of shortcomings here. The frog player base has spec'd into skin that offers stamina regeneration in the water, since it can directly exchange oxygen with its surroundings when wet. This is a useful ability, especially given how costly the frog's jump is in terms of stamina. However, this skin offers nothing in terms of defense and is easily pierced by any attack. The frog also lacks any form of damage boosting abilities, having no teeth to boost its bite damage and no horns or spikes to power up its body slam damage, giving it one of the lowest power stats in the game. It does somewhat make up for this with its strong grab, but seeing as this is useless against players in or above the frog's weight class, this doesn't factor into the frog's general power level since it's so matchup dependent. Their intelligence stat isn't much to boast about either.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to talk about with them, where they're like weird in that they're like a carnivorous animal, primarily carnivorous animal, that is so bereft of any tools really to like crack a thing open, like fight a thing, where they pretty much have to only eat stuff that is like way smaller than them, like, and that's typical. Like most predators don't go after stuff that's bigger than them unless you're like a weird pack hunting thing like wolves or humans, for example. That's kind of our specialty niche that we do, is we hunt stuff that's bigger than us, and the way we do it is by getting a bunch of us together and hunting it. But it's not super typical for predators to go after stuff that is like way smaller than them unless they're doing it on like a large scale. So like the obvious thing that would be like a really big thing that eats something that's way smaller than it would be things like whales. But the way they do it is by basically constantly feeding all the time. They swim around with their mouth open and can filter the food out of it that way, is what most of them do. But as far as like even like the kind of hunter like predatory whales, you're not technically whales, but killer whales, orcas, the primary thing they're hunting is not, a fraction of their weight, like it is with a frog, where if you're, a leopard frog here, you're eating little teeny tiny crickets because that's really all you can eat, because if you give them anything bigger than that, they can't do anything with it. Like we couldn't give our toad a cockroach. We couldn't do it. It wouldn't be able to actually bring it down, even though I said it likes to eat bugs, and the cockroach can't really do anything to it either.
Having one of the simplest brain structures of any vertebrate. Now, for some positives, the frog's stealth in most cases is above average. Cryptic coloration is already a good start, and when combined with the fact that their eyes protrude enough to let them remain almost completely submerged while keeping their vision above water, frogs can be pretty stealthy. This plays nicely with the frog's other decent stat, their mobility. The frog's basic movement speed is quite low, definitely not enough to let them escape an attack or chase down prey. However, the frog build relies almost exclusively on unconventional movement options. Their webbed feet give them fairly high swim speed, which is pretty important for escaping attacks underwater. Some frogs also have cling pads, which allow them to climb almost any surface with ease. They aren't speedy climbers, but the range of surfaces they can climb is impressive. However, obviously the frog's best and most important movement ability is their jump, which is by far the best of any vertebrate and second only to the grasshopper in terms of relative distance. This jump ability constitutes the core gameplay of the frog build, but is this actually a worthwhile ability? As an escape option, I think it's good in the right situation, specifically if there's good cover nearby. However, it's not that useful.
And I think that's probably what he's going to go into here. It's good in the right situation, and that situation is where you need to do it once and you're out of there, because it is very energy consuming to do those types of jumps. And so they typically you'll only use it to catch food or escape from being eaten. And like I said, they have maybe one or two of them, and then the energy cost of it starts wearing on them very quickly.
Useful when caught out in the open, while over short distances it makes the user extremely difficult to catch. Its high stamina cost means that if safety is far away, it's likely you'll burn through all of your stamina before you get there, giving your attacker time to catch up. It also does nothing to help when you're already caught in a grab, though some frogs have ways of dealing with this too. Where the frog's jump ability really shines through is as an approach option. It allows the frog to strike targets from a considerable distance, including ones in the air, which is important given that many of the frog's primary targets will have the flying perk. Combined with the frog's excellent tether grab tongue, the frog is one of the best builds in the game at landing grabs on builds that are normally near impossible to hit. Now with that said, leaping at a target requires a huge commitment from the frog player, as the move has a huge amount of end lag, and leaves the user in a potentially vulnerable position. If you whiff this attack, by the time the frog is able to act again, it's likely that your target will either be long gone or counterattacking. Most of the outside player base considers amphibians to be one of the weakest, if not the weakest faction in the entire game. Their abysmal environmental and disease resistance stats make them extremely vulnerable to shifts in the meta, including the climate patch that's been recently added to the game.
Exactly.
With all of this said, despite the harsh, rapidly changing meta of the Anthropocene expansion, there are plenty of frog builds that have still had decent success in this meta. At the bottom of the tier list we have the Tree Frog. The Tree Frog build swaps out the webbed feet for cling pads, meaning they don't have that great of swim speed, but gain a near unparalleled climbing ability similar to...
This is kind of the opposite of what I was expecting. I was thinking the tree frogs are going to be higher because, like I said, I think the climbing and mobility is great, and I feel like the being in water is a riskier environment than being up in the trees. Like, yeah, there's stuff you got to worry about up in the trees, but it's not like... It ain't like swimming where you've got not only the same like birds that are a problem when you're up in the trees, but also like you got 360 degrees of danger when you're swimming around on the surface because there's obviously a million fish that eat them too, and things like turtles.
To the gecko. My main issue with this build is that the Tree Frog playstyle turns the awesome jumping ability of the frog into more of a liability than an advantage. Jumping to escape a predator's attack means that you're risking taking some pretty serious fall damage. This also means that jumping to catch bugs midair is a non-option, negating the main benefit of having the ability in the first place. Now, some do mitigate this drawback by also speccing into the webbed feet ability, which, while normally only useful for water mobility, can also have the niche effect of reducing fall damage. Still, picking up a costly extra ability for its secondary effect isn't exactly the mark of a top tier. In D tier, we have, well, basically all of the pond frogs that stick really close to the standard frog build that I laid out at the start of this video.
I said, this is the group that I was expecting him to put F tier, was all of these. Basically.
They have a great jump, webbed feet to boost aquatic movement speed, and solid camouflage. And since I just spent the beginning of the video explaining why I think this isn't enough to be viable, I won't spend any more time discussing them here. They at least get the main benefits out of the abilities that they do have, though, and are undoubtedly more successful than amphibians like salamanders, so I can't place them in bottom tier. In C tier we have the common toad build. The reason toads tend to fare better than your standard pond frog is that they're significantly more sturdy. While they aren't exactly armored, their thicker skin is quite good at reducing incoming damage.
See, I would argue that, like, I agree that the toad belongs higher than, like, the pond frogs do, but I would maybe argue that the tree frog belongs higher than the toad, too. It's like, yeah, the toad's a little bit bulkier, but, like, is it bulkier to a degree that, like, actually is preventing anything from hurting it that wouldn't also be able to hurt the frog, like the tree frog? Like I think about, because we have tree frogs here, we have two great tree frogs that live at the Science Center, and we also have an American toad that lives here, and like looking at those, I can't think of like a predator that exists in this area that would look at the gray tree frog and be like, that's food, but then look at the toad and be like, oh, that's too much for me to handle. Like I don't know if the bulkiness like gets it anything extra necessarily there, and in return it's just kind of a less mobile frog. I guess they do kind of have like the burrowing, kind of the environments they live in are probably a little bit better cover than arguably being a tree frog is, but I think you lose out on a lot of the mobility by not being able to climb.
Other frogs are so fragile that even smaller insects can deal lethal damage. Toads, on the other hand, can tank at least a few hits, which is usually enough to let them overcome most arthropod opponents. This thicker skin has the secondary effect of granting them more resistance to dehydration, giving them versatility and range that the standard pond frog can't match. This does come at a cost though, as toads have a much less powerful jump. However, since they're less vulnerable to attacks, quickly jumping to safety isn't as crucial. Most toads also incorporate mild chemical defenses to help discourage builds from higher weight classes from griefing them. However, when it comes to toxic defenses, few builds in the game can boast about poison damage more so than the poison dart frog. The poison dart frog sports the lowest stats of any frog build, even going so far as to drop its stealth rating too, all in the name of spending every possible evolution point on one of the most toxic defensive poisons in the game. Their poison is strong enough to drop any player's HP to 0 relatively quickly after biting the frog player. Personally, I've never been a fan of poison strats since it requires you to be attacked and take damage in order to actually activate its effect. On top of this, there are very few abilities that I'd suggest such drastic sacrifices in order to attain. So the fact that the poison dart frog cuts all of its stats in order to min-max for poison damage isn't something I consider that good of a strategy.
Yeah, but here's the thing, and this is why I was thinking they were going to be... I mean, he's, I think, approaching the end of this, and probably aren't going to be too many above this. Is that we still haven't done bullfrogs yet, which is the other one I thought he might put high. But the reason I think this works relative to a lot of other animals, because I'm kind of in agreement with him on here, is that being poisonous is not like my favorite way of protecting yourself, because of exactly what he said. Like it works as a deterrent, but if it doesn't work as a deterrent, in order to work, you have to like get attacked and get bitten and maybe even just like get eaten to have the effect come into play, which feels not great to me. But I think the one thing, and it's expensive, which is the other thing he just mentioned here. And I think the reason it kind of works with frogs is because they are kind of, to get into sort of the video gaminess of this that it's kind of going into, by min-maxing into having this poison, I think it works better for frogs than it does for most stuff, because everything else that the frog has is already so bad. Like, yeah, you're sacrificing, you know, your health a little bit. Like, you're a little more frail of a thing just because, like, you got to commit more energy into making the poison. But if you're a frog, you're already super frail. Like, losing a little bit of, like, durability isn't a big deal if you're a frog, because your durability is bad to begin with. The one thing that they do obviously sacrifice is like the camouflagey stealthiness, but like I said, that's for display purposes to like tell stuff around them, hey, I'm poisonous. So like I said, it's going in super, super hard on this one thing, which can be good. And like I said, I think it really can be good if you are an animal that is in kind of a situation where you are kind of overall just sort of a low tier, where having this hyper specialization is actually a way to like find a niche. So I think even though it's pretty atypical, like something like this, I think is actually a pretty optimal way for frogs to go. Like, go in super hard on this one thing and just accept that you're like never going to be dominant like in your ecosystem in the way that like a lot of mammals are like trying to be. And just like I said, exist, find your niche, be there. There's nothing wrong with like being a mid-tier. Mid-tiers continue existing.
There are diminishing returns on toxin, and having a poison deadly enough to one-shot an entire herd of elephants doesn't help you that much more than a poison that would inflict pain and sickness debuffs onto a mid-sized carnivore. Both achieve the same purpose of discouraging attacks from predator players. Now, if the poison dart frog player base ever specs into fangs and uses this toxin for venom, maybe they'll break into the top tiers.
Disagree. Again, I am not a huge fan of venom as a thing. Again, because it's really expensive. And again, if you're a frog who is like seemingly like thinking he wants to use venom as like a defensive thing, like a threatening bite, which like really nothing does. Like if you have venom, you're using it to catch food, which would maybe be useful for a frog, because even that, like if you're a frog and you have fangs, like I guess presumably you're getting a whole suite of other teeth too. But if you're something that's venomous, you're probably something that is like going for food of a certain scale. And we talked about how frogs have trouble not just like dealing with food that is like bigger than them, but even like eating food that's bigger than them, because they don't have any hard parts. Like I can put a dead mouse in front of a frog, and the frog can't do anything with it because it doesn't have any way to break it up into pieces that it can actually swallow, because it doesn't have any hard parts to do it. It doesn't have any teeth, doesn't have any claws, doesn't have like any physical strength to do that. So if you're like a frog that is getting like a fang to bite things to kill it, like what are you doing with that thing afterwards? Like you're still stuck. You got to develop a whole suite of other things to like accommodate actually being able to use that venom for anything useful. Otherwise, like I said, it's just expensive.
Still, the fact that they can essentially one-shot anyone who attacks them is pretty impressive and earns them an above-average spot on the tier list. In A tier, we have the Bullfrog, which is essentially just your basic frog build, but with greatly improved stats. Your average frog is vulnerable to attacks from fish, birds, insects, and snakes, but with their added bulk and power, bullfrogs have solid matchups against all of these, and can even hold their own against powerful predator builds like the house cat. Because of their favorable matchup spread, the bullfrog player base has started to take over pond servers that they don't usually spawn in, which is the hallmark of a high tier build. Bullfrogs don't have any
cane toads, maybe number one?
Special defensive abilities or poison, relying solely on their bulk to carry them. But imagine if they did have poison in addition to their great stats. Well, that's essentially the cane toad build. The stats of a bullfrog combined with the thick skin and poison defense of a toad. The cane toad avoids making the same mistakes as the poison dart frog. Investing only a moderate amount of evolution points into toxins grants the cane toad a poison that's dangerous enough to thwart most predatory builds, without going overboard and wasting evolution points on an overly lethal elephant slaying toxin that it doesn't need. The efficiency of this build allows it to easily take over and dominate the Australian meta. And in fact, the first video that I ever made on this channel was all about how broken they are. However, that was 3 years ago, and the meta is shifting, with some intelligence builds learning the cane toad matchup and using this knowledge to minimize the potential poison damage by attacking only the toad's weak point and avoiding the poison glands. So I wouldn't be surprised if the cane toad started to drop down from S tier as intelligence builds expose more of the toad's flaws. But as flawed as they are, the frog build has come a long way. The amphibian faction as a whole has very humble beginnings, but the strategies that they pioneered, like swapping their fins for legs and gills for lungs, are still very much relevant to today's meta. If you're interested in learning more about how amphibians and other builds changed the meta, I recommend the documentary Leaps in Evolution, which features some of the highest quality prehistoric animal CG as intelligent.
So he had tree frogs, pond frogs, toad, dart frog, bullfrog, cane toad. Yeah, and I guess like the couple things I would maybe swap around on mine, and we talked about it. Like I said, I think I would slide the pond frogs down to F. I think I would swap them with the tree frogs. I'm actually kind of fine keeping tree frogs and toads where they are. Like the toad in C tier feels okay to me, and like above the tree frog. He kind of convinced me on that. I like wasn't really thinking about the toad having the like poisonous, feel weird calling it poison because it's so mild, but it's poison. Having the poison stuff with it is good. I know I just went on a rant about how I don't think poison's that good, but like I said, frogs, it's kind of a sliding scale where frogs are pretty much all low tier if we're being honest. So ones that have kind of anything specific are better than most. The other, I think I would probably swap the bullfrog with the dart frog. He makes a good point about the diminishing returns on the poison. Like dart frogs are probably more poisonous than they need to be. Because like I said, they have enough poison to kill an elephant, and one, they don't live where elephants live. They live in South America, and there's not elephants there. But also, like, they wouldn't have to worry about elephants. Like, elephants aren't going to be their predators anyway. So, and it's a thing we've talked about a handful of times too, is sort of diminishing returns on things. I'm trying to think what the other thing was. Maybe was it the antlers on some of the giant Ice Age deer, where you get kind of diminishing returns on the scale of the antlers, and it just gets more expensive for not that much benefit. It's a valid point. Like I said, still think I would switch the bullfrog and the dart frog for one another, just because again, like with the bullfrog, basically what you're doing is you're taking up the common like low tier pond frog and is bulking it up enough to the point where it like doesn't have quite as many predators to worry about, but it still has a lot of predators. Like it's still not dominating its environment by any means in such a way that you would expect like an A tier thing to do. I like cane toads as the top one, and they're interesting because they arguably like have a reputation that is probably disproportionately strong to how good they are because they're such a famous invasive species, where they are native in the Americas. They're like South American toad in Central and South America. But because they're so infamous as an invasive species, specifically in Australia, where there's like just nothing there to really deal with them, they said they kind of have this reputation for really being like a dominant type of species, that they, like I said, arguably probably don't deserve, just because like you'll get that with invasives. I mean, like we have zebra mussels around here that can get into a lake and absolutely take it over, but you don't hear people talking about zebra mussels as like dominating ecosystems, being like an apex thing within the ecosystem, because they're not that in their native environment, because stuff can deal with them there, but we don't have that stuff to deal with it here, so they take over. And I said, and cane toads are kind of in the same situation over in Australia. But I think we will call that a wrap. Thank you guys for watching. The Headwaters Science Center is, Headwaters Science Center is open 7 days a week. So if you come by on Monday through Saturday, we are open 9:30 to 5. If you come by on Sunday, we are open from 1 to 5. So you can come by after lunch on Sunday. Tomorrow's show is going to be tomorrow's Saturday, and it's actually a snake feeding day tomorrow. So it'll be snake feeding with Ridley probably tomorrow. So that sounds interesting. You can tune back in. Sunday will be Spencer doing something. I don't know. Spencer kind of is on his own thing a lot of the times. But like I said, we've got a couple shows coming up the next few days. So like I said, if snake feeding sounds interesting, tune in tomorrow at 3:30. We do these shows live every day at 3:30. Subject changes, the interpreter changes. So like I said, keep checking in, and one of these days you'll probably find something that's interesting to you.